The Trump administration has zeroed in on the threat of drugs and crime. But the relationship between transnational drug traffickers and gangs in the U.S. is complex and varied. Policies that don't account for those relationships are likely to fail. President Donald Trump repeatedly referenced the threat of drugs and violence brought to the U.S. by Mexican cartels during his presidential campaign. Less than a month into office, he signed an executive order directing the federal government to thwart transnational criminal organizations and calling for the removal of foreigners involved in those organizations. Attorney General Jeff Sessions has said repeatedly he plans to go after the illegal drug trade to bring down violent crime, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement has increased arrests of undocumented immigrants, expanding their search to those who were not previously targeted for removal. But since Trump took office, his and Sessions' focus seems to be less on transnational criminal groups like Mexican drug cartels and more on criminal groups active in the U.S., specifically MS-13, formed in the U.S. in the 1980s by Central American immigrants who were deported to their home countries in the 1990s, where the gang expanded rapidly. But their response to MS-13 doesn't appear to be backed throughout the law enforcement community. Acting Drug Enforcement Administration Chief Chuck Rosenberg and other DEA officials considered Mexican cartels more dangerous because of their financing and organizational complexity. Police chiefs from areas most affected by MS-13's presence have said Trump's policies would have a negative impact on efforts against the gang. Sessions and Trump have not backed off their positions, and Rosenberg reportedly plans to leave the DEA on October 1. What policies his successor pursues remain to be seen, but any effort to combat the drug trade by going after gangs and cartels will need to account for the distinct roles those organizations play in that lucrative and resilient trade. It's a very complicated link. Reuters authorities in the U.S. regularly make drug-related arrests of individuals linked to Mexican criminal organizations. In January, 2 Washington men were arrested in a drug sting that began with one of them claiming to work for Ismael El Mayo Zambada, a top leader in the Sinaloa cartel. In February, an investigation in North Carolina led to the arrests of 3 people allegedly in direct communication with Mexican drug traffickers. In March, suspects who were allegedly part of an organization linked to the Zetas cartel were arrested in relation to marijuana fields in eastern Texas. In June, 7 people linked to the Sinaloa cartel were indicted in Los Angeles. The suspects in these cases may well all be linked to Mexican drug cartels, but links don't necessarily mean membership or a direct role in that cartel's operations. I think everyone agrees that Mexican drug cartels have far-reaching supply chains in both directions, from the Andes to the U.S., David Shirk, a professor at the University of San Diego, told Business Insider this spring. Where there's disagreement is the extent to which Mexican drug traffickers are engaged in retail or mid-level control of the drug industry in the United States. Reuters. What is an operative? Said Shirk, who is director of USD's Justice in Mexico program. Are we talking about, like, your man in Durango, Colorado, who's sort of reporting directly back to Chapo Guzman? Or are we talking about basically the fact that there's someone who has a connection in that small town that is able to move drugs or obtain drugs from a Mexican supplier? Mexican cartels have extensive control over the production and transportation process for illegal drugs into the U.S. The cartel's raison d'etre is getting drugs over borders, Shirk noted. But much of the retail trade is handled by street gangs and other criminal groups in the U.S., according to the DEA's 2016 National Drug Threat Assessment. The cartels use gang members. They use individuals that are living here in the United States to basically do the distribution and the logistics here in the United States. Mike Vigil, former director of international operations for the DEA, told Business Insider earlier this year. Many of those groups have a common language and background with the cartels and have built partnerships on shared geographic, linguistic, or ethnic lines, but they are not necessarily controlled or directed by those cartels. Drug deals on U.S. streets, and the violence done to enforce them, are the prerogative of U.S. gangs, not the cartels. Reuters/ICE handout DEA assessments have painted broad swaths of the U.S. as territory under the control of Mexican cartels, chief among them the Sinaloa cartel, an embattled organization previously run by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. However, cartel territorial control is likely defined much more loosely in the U.S. than in Mexico,